Thanks so much. Thanks so much. I feel like it's a big honor to be here in what I think is a prestigious seminar series, and thanks to all of you for being here to listen. I'm going to talk about air quality in the Uinta Basin, and I am going to kind of make the assumption that most of you are somewhat unfamiliar with the situation, and maybe unfamiliar a little bit at least with the Uinta Basin. And so I'll give an introduction, a small bit to the basin itself. And if you are familiar with the situation and the winter ozone issue already, then when it comes to the question time, feel free to ask detailed questions all that you want. This is the principal preoccupation of my professional life well over a decade, and it's something I love to talk about. I know also some of the questions that were submitted were specific to air quality on the Wasatch Front. I do some research about air quality on the Wasatch Front and stay abreast of that issue, so try me if you'd like when it comes to the question time on that too. So the Uinta Basin is where I live and work and have raised my family for the last 12 years. It's a place of, in my view, amazing beauty, a place where you can get into nature and still experience solitude there, which is maybe increasingly rare. We have our own arch, just like Moab. We only one, but we do have our own arch there too, and it has been, for my family at least, just a wonderful place to live. This is my daughter at Dry Fork Creek above our home. And so I guess I feel like maybe at least in the Uinta Basin, then sometimes we joke that the Wasatch Fronters think that Utah stops at Park City. And I just want to give a plug that Eastern Utah is a wonderful place as well. And also, you might know, the Uinta Basin, in addition to being a beautiful place for getting outdoors, is Utah's hub for oil and gas. The dots on this map of Utah, the orange ones are gas wells, the red ones are oil wells. Uinta Basin produces about 90% of the oil that's produced in our state, about 80% of the natural gas. And we were talking about this just earlier, but the distribution networks for oil and gas are complex. But we produce a lot more oil and gas in the Uinta Basin than is consumed in the state. The system of distribution basically means that if you're on the Wasatch Front, turning on your furnace or filling up your car with gasoline, probably the oil and gas came from the Uinta Basin where I live. I also want to mention that in addition to being an important energy source for the state, it's an important economic driver for the state. A recent estimate is that indirectly and directly, oil and gas in Utah is responsible for about $15 billion into the state's economy annually. Also, by way of introduction, then this graph shows energy production in the Uinta Basin from the year 2000 to almost the present. My little dots there are kind of a guess at where we're going to be in 2023. This is millions of barrels of oil equivalent. So the natural gas is converted to equivalent energy units. What you can see in this is that from around 2004 to 2014, then with the fracking boom and high energy prices, we had a big increase in Utah with oil and gas production. And then the bottom fell out of the market, and for about another 10 years, well, like a little less than that, then we saw a decline in total energy production. Mostly natural gas production is what dropped, and it dropped about 50% over that short period from 2014 to 2020. And then largely because of the war in Ukraine, then prices have turned around, and now we're moving back in the other direction. And especially with oil moving really aggressively in the other direction, we have recently become the 9th largest oil-producing state in the country and are on track to produce, we're already producing more oil than we ever have before, and we're producing way more oil than the Salt Lake refineries can handle, and so increasingly oil is trucked over into Price on rail lines. So things are moving quickly in the Uinta Basin, and I'll talk about how that impacts air quality shortly. So I wanted to give going to go through a timeline of air quality in the Uinta Basin with some interspersions for background information. And one bit of background that I want to to give is about the Bingham Research Center itself. The center was established in 2010 and really was designed to be a source for research and information about energy and how to produce energy in our region to keep the economy strong. So it really had kind of an economic development component from the beginning, not really an air quality component at the beginning. There's a couple of folks who are involved in our air quality issues from a couple of different angles that are going to kind of talk about how we interact with stakeholders in the Bingham Research Center.
My interest definitely started with air quality and remains with air quality, but even more, it's the prospect of the Uinta Basin, which is a relatively small community that is economically dependent on a set of industries. The extraction industries also has the mountainous constraints that impact air quality. Because it is a relatively small community, the prospects for being able to work collaboratively, they're both better and more imperative. Environmentalists and members of industry don't have much of a chance to interact typically. There has been an opportunity over the last decade that the ozone problem has been understood to be a problem. And there's been increasing opportunities for people from different backgrounds to interact and try to solve the problem in a way that no one gets more impacted than anyone else.
Energy and air quality are definitely very intertwined. The Uinta Basin is really unique in terms of the ozone situation, where you need to have emission sources, which are coming from our industry. You also need to have snow. If you have one and not the other, we don't have an ozone challenge in the basin, and that's been unique and a complicated puzzle to unravel. But in the basin, the oil and gas industry really is the main industry, and so we do carry a lot of the responsibility for helping to address this problem.
The Bingham Research Center has been marvelous at building trust among the different stakeholders, the different factions, the urban, the rural. What we have now is this common language of science and evidence that all accept and all are willing to use. Emissions are not a quick fix either. Reducing emissions from oil and gas extraction so that you have the greatest efficiency possible is a very long prospect.
10 years ago, we were drilling small, single, vertical wells. And being able to put emissions control devices on all of those pieces of equipment was very cost challenging. Today, we're drilling large pads that have 10 plus, 13 plus wells on them that turn horizontally and extend out 2 to 3 miles, and with a much greater volume of production on that single well footprint. And that allows us to have economies of scale in terms of investing on much more efficient control devices and technology to bring down emissions.
Debbie and Ricky have both become good friends over the years that we've worked together, even though they approach the issue from very different directions. As we got established in the Bingham Research Center, then it very quickly became apparent that we needed to focus on not just energy research generally, but specifically on air quality, partly for the reasons that Debbie and Ricky both talked about in the video. How this came about is that an oil company in 2009 had violated some air quality standard and was facing a fine from EPA, and EPA gave them the option of instead putting in an air quality monitoring station to see what things looked like. As oil and gas, as I showed, had been going up, then they were concerned about air quality impacts, especially summertime ozone. That's when ozone normally forms. We'll talk a little bit about that. Salt Lake City has a summertime ozone issue. They put in these stations thinking that they got a deal, and it turned out they probably would have made a different choice if they'd known what they would have seen. But before we get there, one more bit of background just to make sure we're all on the same page. Ozone is a regulated air pollutant because it impacts human health. What happens, it's very reactive, so you breathe it in and it reacts with your lung tissue and effectively just inflames your lungs. And this is a picture of healthy lungs and unhealthy lungs from breathing ozone. For people who have otherwise healthy lungs, then what happens is usually a decrease in lung capacity that you may not notice unless you're maybe a competitive runner. But for people who have asthma or emphysema, then it can be life-threatening. And indeed, about 6,000 people, the last estimate that I saw was about 6,000 people in the US, each year ozone contributes to their death. So it's not a small issue in the Uinta Basin or elsewhere. I also wanted to talk about the economic impacts of the ozone issue, because I think that impacts human health as well. And the way that ozone impacts that economic health is that air quality regulations are costly. A recent regulation that was promulgated by EPA is estimated to have a compliance cost just for the Uinta Basin of $250 million. So as oil and gas becomes more expensive because of the air quality issue and regulations to comply with it, companies that are now producing oil and gas in the Uinta Basin might go elsewhere, and oil and gas might not be produced there anymore. From a climate perspective, we could say, okay, good, we want to move away from fossil fuels to deal with the climate crisis. And maybe eventually that's a good idea, but shutting off the industry overnight has real impacts for real people. When you saw the downturn in the energy production in the Uinta Basin from 2014, that period of 2014, 15 to 17 was a really challenging period for a lot of people that I know personally, friends and neighbors, even coworkers. People lost their jobs. The family had to split up as someone moved to another oil-producing basin that still had jobs. People lost health insurance, lost their homes. Those sort of things translate into health impacts as well. There are a lot of studies that show that those sorts of stressors in our lives can be as bad for our health as air quality. So there's at least I believe, there's a balance we need to strike. We definitely want to have clean air, but we don't want to do that at the expense of people's livelihoods. And that's hopefully, as the video pointed out as well, that's really where the balance we're trying to achieve through scientific research at the Bingham Research Center. Solve the problem while allowing economic development to continue. So back to the timeline here. These two air quality stations that were established, as I mentioned, started in July 2009. This is actual data from one of the stations at Ouray. And so you see just a time series along here, and then the orange squiggle is the daily maximum 8-hour average ozone. That's the kind of convoluted metric that EPA uses for deciding whether you're in or out of attainment. And you can see in parts per billion, the EPA standard is 70 here. And so the stations started up, and the summer looked great when they were looking for air quality problems, and they thought, oh, we're doing awesome. We don't have an issue. You can see it's declining as you move towards winter. As I'll talk about in a moment, ozone formation requires sunlight, and as you get less sunlight in the winter, naturally you have less ozone. But then the winter hit, and we had snow on the ground, and there were many, many days of ozone well over the EPA standard, and that really threw a lot of people into a panic. And the local county, Uinta County, had been heavily involved in the establishment of the Bingham Research Center, and when they saw these numbers, then they came to the center and said, we need you guys to figure out what's going on here. And that's actually how I ended up in Vernal at the Bingham Research Center. So to give a little background about why this is so unexpected, first of all, ozone is not emitted from any sources. Many of you may know this, some may not. It's instead organic compounds, or VOC is often the acronym for volatile organic compounds that's used, or nitrogen oxides are emitted from sources. So NOx comes from basically any combustion. And organic compounds in places like here in the Salt Lake Valley will be coming from car tailpipes, from lawnmowers. That's the smell you smell when you fill up your car with gasoline. Also in large cities, then personal care products like deodorant and household cleaners are large sources of organics. Where we live in the Uinta Basin, oil and gas is organic compounds, so any emissions from that industry, any leaks or inefficiency ends up coming into the air as organics. But typically, because cities like Salt Lake City have a lot of industrial and urban sources packed together, oh, did we lose it? We're back again. Then these are places where ozone pollution usually occurs. So Boise, Salt Lake City, Denver, all have ozone problems in the summertime. The whole East Coast, large cities throughout the world have summertime ozone problems. The reason that it happens in the summer is because these compounds, organic compounds and NOx, can only react to make ozone in the presence of sunlight. And so the summer you have more sun, and that's why it happens. The one key, not to get too deep into the chemistry, but radicals, which are molecules with the unpaired electron, are critical to making this go forward. They catalyze the reaction that turns organics and nitrogen oxides into ozone. And also critically, the source of those radicals, hydroxyl radical is the important one, that the chemical pathway that leads to that needs water vapor. And the summertime atmosphere is warm, it holds a lot of water, and so we get a lot of radical formation that allows organics and NOx to turn into ozone. But in the wintertime atmosphere, cold air doesn't hold much water. And so it effectively shuts off the source of radicals, and then so organic and NOx can be emitted, but they're not making ozone. Here in Salt Lake, we have very low ozone levels in the wintertime because just for this reason. In fact, ozone some nights goes all the way to 0. That's what makes this area in the Uinta Basin special, is how I like to term it. The Uinta Basin and the Upper Green River Basin in the Pinedale area are the only places in the world where ozone forms in the wintertime. And there's a kind of a Goldilocks specific set of conditions that allow that to happen. There have been occasionally single days, like in the Denver area where conditions are right. In the Wind River Basin, it looks like sometimes there's a little bit of elevated ozone, but even in the Upper Green River Basin, the issue doesn't happen very often. It's much more common and persistent in the Uinta Basin. The conditions that we need are first snow cover. So I mentioned sunlight is important. If you ever got a sunburn while skiing, you know that the snow reflects sunlight, and so that overcomes our sunlight problem in the winter if we have snow cover. And that is, the other part of that sunlight issue is that, as you can see in this satellite image, even when most of the rest of the United States at similar latitude doesn't have snow, because of our altitude in the Rocky Mountain region, then it's colder here. So we're lower latitude where there's more sun, but we're higher altitude where the snow sticks around. If we were in Canada, we wouldn't see much winter ozone because there's not enough sunlight. If we were down lower, either in latitude or altitude, we wouldn't see much ozone because there's not enough snow. So we're in just the right spot in that way. Of course, everyone who lives on the Wasatch Front knows about the topography and the meteorology that allows long, strong winter inversions to form. In the Uinta Basin, my coworker who just retired, Mark Mansfield, did a study that showed that the strength of the inversion, so how tightly the pollution gets packed down, and also how long these inversions last, is much worse in the Uinta Basin than any other major valley or basin in the Rocky Mountain West. So we have those cards stacked against us as well. And then there's one more component, and Ricky Renko in the video alluded to this, and that is that we have not just pollutant emissions, but pollution from the oil and gas industry is actually a critical component. The reason I mentioned the unpaired electron containing molecules, the radicals, before, is that that's the key that makes it so that we can have ozone in the winter in the Uinta Basin and you can't in Salt Lake City. What happens is we have a lot of emissions of organic compounds from oil and gas. As I mentioned, that's what oil and gas is. And so the organics build up to really high levels that you don't see in urban areas. And slowly at first, and then faster as it goes, as they react in the atmosphere, then the chemical reactions that they undergo make their own radicals. So it's a self-perpetuating mechanism that can't occur unless you have really high concentrations of organics, which really only come from the oil and gas industry. And so that's how this is so tightly tied up to the livelihood of most people who live in the Uinta Basin. Okay, so a little bit more about the Bingham Research Center. Our goal really is to do academic research, but with the input from diverse stakeholders, like appeared in the video, to make sure that the work that we do really targets what's needed to understand and resolve this problem. And then we do a lot of, I guess what you call outreach. We facilitate a working group of a lot of different stakeholders that come together and talk about this issue on a regular basis. We do a program to let people know when high ozone is expected so that the industry can reduce emissions at those critical times when it matters most. Outside of these winter inversions, air quality in the Uinta Basin is similar to the rest of the rural West. It's just these short periods where this can happen when the meteorology is right. And so we try to target those periods and reduce emissions to the best we can in cooperation with industry. And our work has been used by a lot of different stakeholders in a lot of different ways. In a lot of different types of regulatory rulemaking. Our work has been cited in numerous lawsuits by environmental organizations. It's also been used, as I'll talk about in just a moment, to design voluntary emissions reduction programs that are really led by industry and used by the public in the Uinta Basin to understand what's going on and how to deal with it. And so I'll give one example of that. Imagine that you're seeing from the air a video or an image of this oil well here. And what we did is use from a helicopter and from the ground a special type of camera, an optical gas imaging camera that can visualize the invisible plumes of natural gas that are coming out of oil and gas facilities. We did this in cooperation with BLM, EPA, Utah Division of Air Quality, and 4 or 5 different oil and gas companies. And so the helicopter surveyed about 3,000 wells in the Uinta Basin, and then from the ground we surveyed emissions from several hundred wells. And when we saw emission sources, then we contacted the companies and said, hey, we saw something, please check it out and tell us what you found and if you fixed it and how much it cost. And what we found from this study is that most of the emissions actually are coming from these tanks that are storing oil or water. They're a large source of the organic compound emissions that are so critical to ozone production in the Uinta Basin. And what's more, about half of those emissions were from things that were easily preventable. So maybe a valve, they have to open a valve to depressurize the tank before they look inside, and maybe somebody just forgot to close that valve back up. So the gas is just leaking out instead of going to the combustion source that's supposed to eliminate it. There are also hatches on these called thief hatches where you can open up the tank and look inside to see if it's full or also take a sample. And they have a little seal, and simple maintenance of the seal on the hatch will keep it from leaking. Sometimes that maintenance doesn't happen. What came out of this study are 2 different actions. One is the Utah Division of Air Quality used this information to inform their emissions inventory, the database of where all the emissions are coming from. So they had a better picture of, we thought that those emissions were coming to this combustion device rather than going out into the atmosphere, and now we know. And then also the Utah Petroleum Association, led by Ricky Ranko Browning that you saw in the video, they started a program called Latch the Hatch, referring to the thief hatch that I talked about, that you open up to look inside. And now about, I think, 3,500 wells in the Uinta Basin out of about 8,000 or 9,000 producing wells have a sign that looks like this that says, latch the hatch, it's the law, so that when people come on site, then they're reminded that this matters, and this matters to your livelihood as a worker in the industry. And this started kind of the Utah Petroleum Association now has a whole program bigger than just the signs on the wells, and they do flyovers to look at where methane emissions are and have installed a lot of new equipment to reduce emissions, and that kind of came from this study that we did. And so the goal is for us to understand the issue, but also pass that information on in this way so folks can use it. Okay, the last thing I wanted to show, I just talked about and showed data from the early days when this phenomenon was discovered. And I thought it'd be interesting to show where we are now and whether we've made some progress. So this is the same graph from before, the amount of energy, basically fossil energy produced in the Uinta Basin from 2000 to more or less the present. Now, this shows, the dots here show the number of days in the Uinta Basin that were high, that had ozone higher than the EPA standard in each winter shown. And you can see that I have gray down here because that's a year where we really didn't have snow, and when you don't have snow, you don't have winter ozone, and so we kind of count that separately. We had several years of a lot of days, 30 to 40 or more days in the winter where we had ozone over the EPA standard. But if we look at a longer-term trend, then that has been going down. Over the years, we've seen fewer and fewer days with ozone over the EPA standard all the way to 2022. And you can see that really follows the decline in production, of energy production in the Uinta Basin, and really part of the reason for that is there's less oil and gas activity, there are fewer emissions, and we know that that's part of it, but also over that time, programs like Latch the Hatch and also several regulatory promulgations have happened that have changed how the industry operates. So for the same amount of energy produced, there are fewer emissions. But things changed in 2023, and that's the data from 2023. You can see we had well over 30 days that were over the EPA standard this past winter. And we also know, I won't show the data here, but as the industry activity has climbed, so have emissions. We completed a study on that recently, and we know that emissions have moved in the other direction. They haven't come back to where they used to be, but they are up. So the question is, why did we suddenly buck the trend this last year? Was it the really unusual meteorological year that we had, or was it the change in emissions? And it really was an unusual year. This is a photo from one of our research sites south of Vernal, and it looked like this for about 2.5, 3 months. Usually some of the vegetation is uncovered, south-facing slopes are uncovered, but we had near complete snow cover. You can see kind of this texture in the snow. What happens when you get a strong inversion is that it builds up a layer of hoarfrost every night, and so instead of the snow getting dirty and reflecting less and less, it stays bright and can reflect actually week after week, even without new snow, can reflect up to about 90% of the sunlight because of that hoarfrost. So these are really unique situations. So what we can do is, statistically, we can say, okay, so we had a really bad year this year and so many ozone days. We had not so bad a year, at least meteorologically, and so many ozone days. So we can kind of factor out statistically the influence of meteorology, and I won't go into how we do that, and look at if the meteorology was the same, where would we be? Are we better or worse than we expected we might be for a year this kind of meteorologically conducive to ozone production? And that's what I'm showing here. 0 would be the average over the years we have data. The ozone anomaly higher than that is how it would be more ozone days than expected based on meteorological conditions that year. So basically, higher emissions, worse ozone than the average. Below this line is taking into account the meteorology. Are we doing better than we think we would, or better than the average, or worse? So what you can see is even as we get into 2023, we're doing better than we used to do. One way to think about it is if we had 2013 emissions in 2023, we could have expected about 15 more ozone days. We might have had about 50 ozone days because we had conditions that were so good for making winter ozone. So what does this mean? We can take it both ways, right? It means we're getting better. It means the oil and gas industry is cleaner, if we want to use that word, than it used to be. It also means we're clearly not there, right? Because we still in 2023 had more than 30 days that were over the EPA standard. So we're moving in the right direction, but we've got a ways to go. To bring it back to the Wasatch Front, the summertime ozone issue here has been intractable for almost 2 decades. NOx emissions have actually dropped a lot, and the number of ozone exceedance days in the summer in Salt Lake have stayed stubbornly steady. That shows I mean, maybe that we've got longer to go on NOx reductions. Maybe we need to, on the Wasatch Front, target organics reductions. And it also, on the Wasatch Front, it will likely become what is called a serious non-attainment area. So the regulatory world will ratchet down and become more strict, more difficult for development. And I've heard among fellow academics, among regulators, kind of a give up hope attitude a little bit as far as summertime ozone on the Wasatch Front. Maybe we can take some hope out of the Uinta Basin situation, where we're not there yet, but we are getting where we want, at least moving in the right direction where we want to go, even as the industry is going up. So more research to understand the issue, more action by a lot of entities to deal with the issue. We can, I think, solve the issue in the Wasatch Front too. So there's a few things that I hope that you remember from what I had to say. One is that winter ozone in the Uinta Basin is important really for the whole state because of the economic impact of oil and gas, because of the energy impact of oil and gas, but also because of real people that I know that are impacted in their health and economically as well. The other thing I hope that you kind of remember is that the Bingham Research Center at USU, we do research and outreach to help people understand the issue. If we're getting better, though, the credit really belongs to the regulators who've promulgated regulations to make the industry cleaner, and the industry taking voluntary action on their own. And so there's a lot of people from different, including environmental groups, including the Indian tribe, local governments, federal governments, land management agencies that have been working hard on this for the last 13, 14 years. And that's really why we're seeing improvement. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're getting there, but we're definitely not there yet. We've got a ways to go. So that's all I have to share. I want to point out we have funding for the work we do from a lot of different entities. Most important, the Utah Legislature and Uinta County Special Service District 1 provide really ongoing funding that allows our center to exist. And so we're so grateful for them. And thank you for being here. I'm happy to be part of the discussion. Ozone itself has a minimal impact on the inversion meteorology. So in a way, I guess no, I don't think so. If we have plenty of snow, if we have high pressure conditions that make the air stagnant and that allow the inversion to form, then we have the conditions for ozone. And there's some overlap. Some ways that the chemistry, especially particle chemistry, comes back and influences the meteorology, but that kind of back influence is small enough to be negligible. So if we take into account how many days did we have strong inversions, how many days did we have bright sun, how many days did we have snow cover, then those are really, on the meteorological side, the things that impact whether we have high ozone. And so if we take those into account and not emissions, then at least we believe this will let us have an indirect look at how the emissions are changing, or how their impact on winter ozone is changing. We can look at it another way, and we have, looking directly at the ozone-forming emissions, NOx and non-methane organic compounds especially, and we see the same trend there, that they've dropped pretty dramatically through 2020, and now are on the rise as the industry goes the other direction, but the rise is slower relative to total energy production than we would expect based on how things looked in the early days. Does that help a little bit? If I understood it hopefully correctly, what you were trying to ask? Inventory is too strong of a word. Mark Mansfield, maybe in 2015, did a study to try to look at that. There are naturally occurring emissions of non-methane organics. in the Uinta Basin and really any oil and gas producing basin, they pressurize and then find their way to the surface through fault lines or whatever. And it is very hard to quantify that with certainty because those emissions, the natural emissions, tend to be highly localized, and you don't know where that localized source is going to be. And so getting that number all the way across the Uinta Basin is, I would say, fairly impossible, because you might make a lot of measurements and say, oh, it's really low, but you missed the one hotspot, right? But what Mark did is he looked at basically from a geologic perspective, how fast does the natural gas, because the oil isn't coming up, I mean, except in the Beverly Hillbillies situation, but we've used all that oil a long time ago, and that never happened in the Uinta Basin. So it's gas that's coming up, right? So he looked at kerogen maturation rates from geological literature, and how much can we expect in a given year to be produced. So assuming equilibrium, how fast would that come up to the surface? How much could come up to the surface? And it's somewhere around 5% of what we expect or what we think the kind of surface activity emissions to be. So fairly low. Or in other words, we could say before oil and gas production, we probably had air quality problems in the Uinta Basin, but it would have been more like what Salt Lake City had in the 50s and 60s with coal burning and stuff like that. We probably didn't have a winter ozone problem because the organics from natural emissions were there, but probably too low. There hasn't been a lot. One problem is that, say, if you're looking at impacts to asthmatics, there are a lot of things that trigger an asthma attack, right? Not just air quality. And so the studies that look at this really well use big populations, because then you can statistically tease out the impacts of air quality over the impacts of having a pet in the home, or allergens, or colds and flus, or something like that. That's harder in the Uinta Basin where we have a small population. We did look some years ago at asthma cases, specifically asthma-related hospital visits in the Uinta Basin, and you don't see a correlation even on kind of the worst air quality days. We don't think that's because there's no impact. We think it's because the statistical noise is too high. There was a study in Pinedale where they did this a little more robustly. They looked at all respiratory-related clinic visits, because air quality can make, so if you have a cold, it can make the symptoms worse and make you have to go to the doctor where otherwise you might not. And so this was every respiratory-related visit to a doctor in Pinedale over a few years, and they showed that with, I think it's a 1-day lag time, that when there was higher ozone, you saw an impact on the number of people going to the doctor. So this is similar to what people see for summertime ozone. Maybe a case could be made that in the winter people spend more time indoors, and indoor ozone is usually lower than outdoors. But that would be a pretty tricky nuance to get to with such a small population. So I think the background that we need is that, and I kind of showed it before, in the summertime there's more natural ozone, and I didn't make that clear. There's always ozone in the air. You're breathing it right now. It's when it gets above a certain level when your body kind of recognizes it and sees harm from it. And so in the summer in the Rocky Mountain West, then the background level, the ozone that's just kind of here because it's here from global industry, from intrusion of high ozone air from the stratosphere, right, where the ozone is good, that background level is somewhere around 55 to 65 parts per billion. And the EPA standard is 70, so this is what you're talking about, right? We only have 5 ppb to work with for the Wasatch Front summer ozone issue. We have more ppb to work with in the winter in the Uinta Basin, since the wintertime background is somewhere around 45 to 55. But still, if you're looking at how close are we to the standard, the majority of it is ozone we can't control. The majority of it is ozone blowing in from outside. It's a little easier in the Uinta Basin because you said stuff we can't control. I think you mean stuff from out of state or out of country. There's also an issue where the federal laws don't allow the state to regulate, say, what comes out of tailpipes of cars, because they do that at the national level with some exceptions. And there's other things, the regulatory side of that is a little outside my world, but here on the Wasatch Front, most of the pollution is coming from people, right? The industry is relatively small. Most of the emission sources are homes and cars and businesses, that sort of thing. And it's, first of all, politically very difficult to regulate individuals in their homes and cars. Second of all, there are some federal laws that limit what you can do there. And so the hands of the state regulatory agency, Utah DEQ, are a little bit tied. In a way, that's an advantage in the Uinta Basin because there's no rules against regulating the oil and gas industry, but then also the industry is one industry that to an extent can work together, like I talked about, and make voluntary emissions controls, whereas it's a lot harder to kind of corral the troops when you're talking about everyday residents of the basin. It can be regenerated. The most robust science shows very clearly that what I showed, the lung irritant health impact, happens and is most important for people with already impaired lungs. There is some data that associates ozone pollution with the same kind of thing that particulate pollution, the haze that happens here in the wintertime, and to an extent there too. Like that kind of chronic impacts like heart disease, adverse birth outcomes. There's some data that connects ozone pollution to that, but it's more challenging because the impacts are less clear, and it's hard to find times where you have ozone and not particulate pollution and that sort of thing. So then it gets a little more gray. We know for sure that these acute impacts to our lungs when we breathe it in are real. If you make it through, then your lungs will heal completely from that. I think does that answer that question? Yeah, these studies have been done, and what happens with any toxicant is the more studies you do, the lower level at which you start to see harmful effects. There is at least some evidence, it gets weaker and weaker the further you go down, that even at around 40 parts per billion, there can be toxic impacts on people. 40 parts per billion is below the wintertime baseline, and the average even before the Industrial Revolution was somewhere around 20 to 40. There's a real push in Washington, D.C. to lower the standard from 70 parts per billion to 60 or 65. Advocacy groups like the American Lung Association push for around 60. But at 65, then, as you said, some years at least then, with no people, no activity at all in the Intermountain West, we're exceeding the standard. We could get lower than that, but that would be a global effort, right? Not even a U.S. effort to get there. This is driven by coal production in India and China and things like that are leading to this background ozone level that's higher than the pre-industrial level. So yes, and that's what makes it complicated is even at that level of 60 parts per billion, there are some health impacts even down there, but it's an impossible standard to meet, and so how do you balance that? I mean, that's really a policy question. I don't think that climate change will solve the problem, because climate change doesn't mean more, like less snow or no snow. It might just mean a whole bunch of snow all at once, and then a warmer winter for the rest of Utah. But if our inversion sets in, then it stays cold and the snow doesn't melt. So we might, maybe, but that'd be a long, long ways out. As far as your comment about how some of our work, and that's true, some of our work showed that some of the high ozone days that could have been used in kind of the regulatory non-attainment designation and where we end up in terms of the strictness of regulations, those were actually caused by natural processes, not by local sources. And that means that we're in a lower designation today with less strict regulations than we would be. And maybe I'll add on to that to say, sometimes what we produce is a win for industry, you could say. Sometimes what we produce doesn't necessarily make the industry happy. Our goal is to find out what is there and let others use it how they will, I guess. Yeah. I think, no, not completely. And to expand on that a little bit, then, the Uinta Basin, besides being kind of the perfect place in the world, or at least in North America, for this winter ozone problem to occur, our industry also has challenges that maybe other oil and gas producing basins don't always have. So for one thing, there are a lot of small companies in the Uinta Basin, and small oil and gas producing companies, they often don't have the resources that large companies do to deal with things like this. The emissions, so I talked about combustion devices on oil storage tanks, and a retrofit especially can be $100,000 or more for one well, and if that well is only producing $1,000 a day of natural gas, that is a long payback time, right? Or sometimes a lot less than that per day. Another thing is that our industry is older. There are the oil and gas producing basins in the US that have the lowest emissions are the new ones, and usually the new ones that are dominated by one or two large companies. We're really kind of the opposite of that. So some of the pipelines and infrastructure are older and require more maintenance, and so the emissions are higher. I do think there's strong evidence that we're going in the right direction, that the industry is cleaner, and per amount of energy produced, there are less emissions than there used to be. So it's going that way. We're certainly not done. Yeah. Yeah, I think compared to at least some other oil and gas basins I'm less familiar with in the Four Corners area, then the Uinta Basin does less flaring because we used to be a mostly gas basin, and it's moving towards oil, but for the most part, the gas infrastructure is there. There are some challenges, especially with new wells, and there are some very big flares. At least this last winter, there were several right in the city of Roosevelt that I think a lot of residents found challenging in the same way that you're talking about. But in general, there's less of that. It definitely contributes to impaired air quality because those flares emit soot and other particulate haze. It's maybe a mixed bag in terms of winter ozone, because if you're not flaring and you're venting that gas, then that's organic compounds that help make ozone. If you are flaring and burning that gas, you're making NOx. And so it's a seesaw that kind of hits you on the way up and the way down. And we have a lot of conversations about that with the engines that power the pump jacks and things too. If you make them more efficient, then there's less organics and more NOx, and if they're less efficient, there's more organic and less NOx. So it's a kind of a catch-22. Better is to put it in a pipeline as you're talking about.
Let's give Seth a big round of applause.